Introduction. A Candle in Hell. The 1960s were an age of prophets. Some preached peace, some promised revolution. But among the flower children and psychedelic mystics rose a darker vision, one of fire, doom, and the inevitable end of humanity. From the shadows of London emerged a man and a woman, Robert de Grimston and MacLean. Together they would create a church that terrified newspapers, fascinated celebrities, and whispered in the ears of killers. They called it the Process Church of the Final Judgment. Their gospel was unlike any other. Christ and Satan were not enemies, but two halves of the divine. Love could not exist without death. Fear could not be understood without ecstasy. The end of the world was not a prophecy, it was a certainty. One of their manifestos began with words like these: "The world of men is the absence of God, and therefore the antipodes of heaven, which is hell. And man carries a candle in hell so that he can pretend he is in heaven." The Process Church of the Final Judgment. This was not hippie optimism. This was apocalyptic gnosis. And yet, behind the robes, the German shepherds, and the sinister imagery, was a story of two people, bound together by fate, love, and destruction. A story of how Robert and Mary Ann became prophets of the apocalypse. Chapter 1. The Meeting of Fire and Ice. London, early 1960s Piccadilly, just past midnight. Robert was crossing the street, lost in thought, when headlights cut through the darkness. A car surged toward him, a gleaming machine accelerating through the night. He saw no driver, only the blinding glare. For an instant he felt death approaching. But then he saw her. A young woman behind the wheel, red-haired, fierce and burning with anger. Robert leapt back to safety. The car passed, and the moment was gone. That woman was Mary Ann. Later he would wonder, was it coincidence, destiny, or the first movement of some darker current?
He wrote years later, she was unforgettable.
Her personality was something like a thunderstorm, a heat wave, and a blizzard all rolled into one. Living with Mary Ann was like living with the whole human race. The Robert de Grimston autobiography. Robert de Grimston, born Robert Moore, had grown up in England with privilege, education, and a restless mind. He had trained as an architect, served in the cavalry, and wandered through philosophy, always searching for meaning. Mary Ann MacLean was his opposite. Born illegitimate in Glasgow, raised in poverty, she survived through cunning, desire, and force of will. She had been many things: street child, hustler, prostitute, and in every role she mastered survival. They were fire and ice, opposites that could only be resolved in collision. Their first real meeting was not on the street, but at the Royal Albert Hall during a concert. Music filled the air, but Robert hardly remembered the notes. Mary Ann eclipsed everything. He admitted he didn't like her at first. Her confidence was abrasive, her eyes burning with challenge, and yet he was drawn in. She loved Wagner and Tchaikovsky. He preferred Bach and Vivaldi. She mocked his pretensions. He dismissed her tastes as unsophisticated. But their disagreements only bound them tighter. Both were seekers. She had wandered through spiritualism, astrology, and the occult. He had explored philosophy and the edges of Christian theology. Their common ground was the mind. The human psyche became their battlefield, their obsession, their temple. Together they stepped onto a path that would lead far beyond psychology, into prophecy, ritual, and apocalypse. As Robert recalled, a simple four-letter word, M-I-N-D, but it heralded for us the start of a strange adventure. The Robert de Grimston Autobiography, Chapter 2. Into the Labyrinth of He Mind. For Mary Ann, life was always a contest. There had to be an enemy, an obstacle, a challenge to overcome. And if none appeared, she would invent one. The mind, for her, was a battlefield. She probed into people's gestures, their voices, their subtle hesitations, tearing away masks until they stood defenseless before her. For her, psychology was not theory. It was a weapon. For Robert, the mind was something different, a labyrinth. A maze filled with riddles, paradoxes, and hidden doors. Behind its twisting corridors, he believed, lay the answers to life's most ancient questions. Why do we suffer? Why do we fear? Why do we long for God yet destroy ourselves? Together they found common ground. The mind was both enemy and mystery, something to be conquered and something to be revealed. Their shared fascination drew them to the strange world of L. Ron Hubbard's Scientology. In the early 1960s, Hubbard had transformed the investigation of the mind into a system of therapy, doctrine, and initiation. Robert and Mary Ann entered his courses and quickly rose to prominence as star pupils. Robert remembered those days. It wasn't that Scientology itself was such a big deal, but it gave me the opportunity to translate my interest in the mind into precise and practical terms. It started me on the road of therapy, working with people in a down-to-earth manner. The Robert de Grimston autobiography. For 6 weeks, they worked as auditors in Hubbard's movement, guiding others through their fears and memories. It was during this time that Mary Ann became Robert's therapist, and something deeper took root. A bond formed, part love, part transference, part destiny. But both of them were too ambitious, too restless to remain under Hubbard's shadow. They began to dream of something more, a movement of their own. Where Hubbard had created a science, they would create a religion. Where Scientology had promised clarity, they would promise salvation. And where psychology sought to cure the mind, they would embrace the soul, even if it meant walking into darkness. Chapter 3. The Birth of the Process. By 1963, Robert and Mary Ann had broken from Hubbard's organization. They gathered a handful of students and followers and began their own experiment. First it was called compulsions analysis, then the process, and finally the Process Church of the Final Judgment. They dressed in flowing black capes, adorned with silver crosses formed into a serpent-like P. They walked the streets with large German shepherd dogs at their sides, guardians, symbols of loyalty, and echoes of the wolf pack. It was theater, yes, but it was also ritual. Everything was designed to pierce the mind, to unsettle, to draw seekers into a confrontation with themselves. But at the heart of the process was a doctrine, one both terrifying and strangely beautiful. The church taught that God had 4 faces: Jehovah, Lucifer, Satan, and Christ. And Jehovah was stern justice and law. Lucifer was light, beauty, and love. The Satan was separation, death, and destruction. A Christ was compassion and union. Together, these 4 were aspects of the divine, not enemies, not contradictions, but necessary opposites. As Robert wrote in one of his sermons, "If love is what we seek, we must know hate. If joy is what we pursue, then we must find agony and feel it. No pendulum can swing only in one direction." The Process Church of the Final Judgment. The process was not a rejection of darkness, it was an embrace. To deny evil was to deny half of God. To reconcile opposites was to know the whole. This was the mystery that drew in artists, seekers, and lost souls. This was the gospel that horrified the mainstream churches. And this was the path that Robert and Mary Ann declared to be salvation, not escape from fear, sex, or death, but the unification of love, sex, fear, and death into one totality. The process had been born. Chapter 4. Love, Sex, Fear, Death. The process. Church was more than sermons. It was a theater of initiation. Members faced trials of confession, rituals of exposure, confrontations that shattered their defenses. Fear was not denied, it was embraced. Lust was not suppressed, it was confronted. Death was not hidden, it was brought to the center of the circle. Their 4 gods were invoked in every teaching: Christ, the reconciler; Lucifer, the light-bearer of love and ecstasy; and Jehovah, the punisher, stern and unyielding; and Satan, the separator, who brought destruction and therefore truth. For Robert, this was the essence of salvation, not to flee from opposites, but to reconcile them. If we have hidden our faces from the hideous facts of war, then we have taken away the gentle harmony of peace from our experience. And if we have shut our eyes to ugliness, then we can never know sweetness or beauty. The process taught that love, sex, fear, and death were not to be avoided, but experienced fully, transcended through confrontation. It was intoxicating and terrifying. Outsiders saw black capes and German shepherds, heard whispers of Satan and the apocalypse, and recoiled. But inside the circle, members felt they had touched the raw nerve of existence. The process was more than a place of worship. It acted as a compass for their existence. Chapter 5. Prophets of Doom. Robert de Grimston became the teacher. His writings circulated among the faithful like scripture. They spoke of the end, not as a possibility, but as certainty. Humanity, he said, had chosen doom. The world was already hell. Salvation lay only in separating from humanity itself, in preparing for the inevitable destruction. One of his texts declared, "Humanity is doomed. If we are part of humanity, identified with humanity, we are doomed. Our only valid course of action is to detach from humanity, climb out of the quagmire of its lies, its hypocrisy, its blind desire for its own destruction, find our own truth and create our own destiny." This was not symbolic. It was prophecy. In Robert's vision, the end of days was imminent. Wars, famine, pestilence, these were not accidents, but the fulfillment of destiny. The many would perish. Only the few, the chosen, the separated, would survive, to rise with the phoenix after the fire. The process did not resist destruction. They welcomed it. For in their gospel, only through annihilation could a new world be born. To many it sounded like madness. To the faithful it was liberation. Chapter 6. Whispers of Blood. The process might have remained a fringe sect, strange but obscure, had it not been for the shadows of murder that crept across their name. In 1969, Charles Manson sent his followers to slaughter seemingly innocent people in the most brutal ways imaginable, spreading fear and terror at the heart of an era. In the fever of paranoia that followed, journalists searched for occult connections, satanic cults, hidden puppet masters. They found the process. The church had indeed published interviews with Manson in their magazine. Some process members had crossed paths with him. And their theology, blending Christ with Satan, was enough to ignite suspicion. Suddenly, headlines screamed of a satanic cult behind the Manson murders. The process denied it, but the myth had already taken root. And into this storm of speculation stepped another figure, Bobby Beausoleil. Beausoleil was no faceless follower. He was a young musician, a drifter with angelic features and a dangerous charisma. Before the murders, he had been part of the countercultural underground, living with artists, musicians, and occultists. He even worked with the filmmaker Kenneth Anger, cast as Lucifer in Lucifer Rising. But by the summer of 1969, Beausoleil's path had turned dark. He murdered Gary Hinman in Los Angeles, a crime that marked the bloody beginning of the Manson family's reign of terror. Whispers soon claimed that Beausoleil too was linked to the process. Some said he had attended their meetings in San Francisco. Others claimed he had been drawn to their apocalyptic theology, their black-robed rituals, their gospel of Christ and Satan united. Beausoleil himself later denied being a member. He admitted he had crossed paths with process people in the Haight-Ashbury scene, but in those days, seekers and wanderers, occultists and prophets, all moved through the same circles. What mattered was not proof but perception. To the public, the lines blurred. The process, Manson, Beausoleil, anger, Satanism, murder, all bound together in a knot of fear. Adam Parfrey and Timothy Willey would later argue that the connection was tenuous, more rumor than fact. But myth is stronger than evidence. And in the myth, Bobby Beausoleil became a living symbol of the process aura, beauty twisted into violence, art fused with blood, the apocalyptic dream made flesh. For the process, this was both curse and fuel. Their name became infamous, whispered in tabloids, pulp paperbacks, and hushed conversations about Satanism. Chapter 7. The Fracture of the Prophets. But prophecy is fragile when the prophets themselves fracture. By the 1970s, Robert and Mary Ann's union began to collapse. He saw himself as the teacher, the channel of divine revelation. She, however, was the true power, fierce, manipulative, and unwilling to surrender control. Their battles spilled into the movement. Disciples took sides. The apocalyptic certainty that once bound them began to dissolve into human conflict. In his later autobiographical notes, Robert reflected with melancholy on their beginning and their end. What had once been destiny became disillusion. The process splintered. Some members drifted into new religious movements. Others tried to continue the church under different names, including the foundation faith of the millennium. But the vision of the black-cloaked prophets was fading. The apocalypse they foretold did not arrive. Instead, their own apocalypse consumed them. Chapter 8. Ashes and Afterlives. Yet myths never die. The process church, though dissolved, lived on in fragments and echoes. Former members carried its teachings into new communities. Writers and occultists preserved its legends. Musicians, artists, and seekers of darkness found inspiration in its imagery. In London, whispers of the process reached the Rolling Stones. Mick Jagger, always alert to dangerous currents in culture, was fascinated by their sinister glamour. At the very moment the Stones were invoking the devil in sympathy for the devil and flirting with occult aesthetics in their satanic majesty's request, the process offered a living gospel of Christ and Satan reconciled, a theology that seemed to mirror the band's own dance with taboo. Across the Atlantic, another current picked up the process signal, George Clinton and his band Funkadelic. Clinton's vision of psychedelic funk was already cosmic, fusing gospel, rock, and futurism. Yet in albums like Maggot Brain, one can hear the same themes of apocalypse and rebirth, of death and ecstasy that haunted the process. Where the church had proclaimed love, sex, fear, death as the totality of experience, Funkadelic transformed it into rhythm, sound, and movement. Clinton would call it, "Free your mind and your ass will follow," a musical mantra not far from the process's demand to embrace darkness in order to find light. Robert withdrew, his writings unpublished, his voice quiet. Mary Ann lived on in shadows, her power undiminished, but her church gone. And yet the theology remained, radical, terrifying, strangely beautiful, that God is whole only when Christ and Satan embrace. That love cannot be separated from fear. That death itself is part of the divine. One of their texts proclaimed, "For every end there is a new beginning, and if we are not of the end, then we shall be of the new beginning. Either we shall be the ashes of the phoenix or his resurrection." Conclusion: the black flame still burns. The process, church of the final judgment, rose and fell in little more than a decade. But its vision was unforgettable, a marriage of opposites, an apocalyptic gospel that dared to reconcile Christ with Satan. It was theater, it was prophecy, it was madness, and yet it was also truth for those who needed it. Perhaps humanity never listened. Perhaps the doom they foretold was only their own. And yet their name lived on, not through sermons or scripture, but through whispers of murder and blood. The interviews with Charles Manson, the rumors of Bobby Beausoleil attending their rituals, the headlines that tied them to the cult of death, all became part of the legend. The reality was quieter. In the early 1970s, as scandal grew, Mary Ann led the remnants of the flock away from the spotlight. They wandered south, building small communities in Mexico, far from the glare of journalists and the hysteria of the United States. There, beneath the desert sun, the process shed its black capes and softened its voice, becoming the foundation faith of the millennium, a faint shadow of the fire that once terrified the world. In myth, the process remained what the public had already decided: prophets of the apocalypse, priests of the marriage of Christ and Satan. Robert himself once wrote, looking back on those days, "What had begun as a collision between two lives became a destiny for many. And though the fire burned out, its smoke lingers still, in places we cannot reach, in hearts we cannot know." The Robert de Grimston autobiography. To this day, the name lingers in books, films, and music, a ghostly echo of the 1960s, when prophets of love and prophets of doom collided. And in the echoes of their words, in the shadows of their rituals, something still burns, a black flame that whispers, "To know love, you must know fear. To know joy, you must embrace death. To know God, you must embrace the devil." The process church is gone, but the prophecy remains. If these shadows of prophecy and apocalypse have stirred something in you, join us on this journey into hidden history. Subscribe to the channel, share this video with fellow seekers, and let the black flame spread. The story is never over, and neither are we.